Serfdom. Condensed version published in the Reader's Digest, April 1945 edition. The author has spent about half his adult life in his native Austria, in close touch with German thought, and the other half in the United States and England. In the latter period, he has become increasingly convinced that some of the forces which destroyed freedom in Germany are also at work here. The very magnitude of the outrages committed by the National Socialists has strengthened the assurance that a totalitarian system cannot happen here. But let us remember that 15 years ago, the possibility of such a thing happening in Germany would have appeared just as fantastic, not only to 9/10 of the Germans themselves, but also to the most hostile foreign observer. There are many features which were then regarded as typically German, which are now equally familiar in America and England, and many symptoms that point to a further development in the same direction. The increasing veneration for the state, the fatalistic acceptance of inevitable trends, the enthusiasm for organization of everything. We now call it planning. The character of the danger is, if possible, even less understood here than it was in Germany. The supreme tragedy is still not seen that in Germany it was largely people of goodwill who, by their socialist policies, prepared the way for the forces which stand for everything they detest. Few recognize that the rise of fascism and Marxism was not a reaction against the socialist trends of the preceding period, but a necessary outcome of those tendencies. Yet it is significant that many of the leaders of these movements, from Mussolini down and including Laval and Quisling, began as socialists and ended as fascists or Nazis. In the democracies at present, many who sincerely hate all of Nazism's manifestations are working for ideals whose realization would lead straight to the abhorred tyranny. Most of the people whose views influence developments are in some measure socialists. They believe that our economic life should be consciously directed, that we should substitute economic planning for the competitive system. Yet, is there a greater tragedy imaginable than that in our endeavor consciously to shape our future in accordance with high ideals? We should, in fact, unwittingly produce the very opposite of what we have been striving for. Planning and power. In order to achieve their ends, the planners must create power over men wielded by other men of a magnitude never before known. Their success will depend on the extent to which they achieve such power. Democracy is an obstacle to the suppression of freedom, which the centralized direction of economic activity requires. Hence arises the clash between planning and democracy. Many socialists have the tragic illusion that by depriving private individuals of the power they possess in an individualist system and transferring this power to society, they thereby extinguish power. What they overlook is that by concentrating power so that it can be used in the service of a single plan, it is not merely transformed, but infinitely heightened. By uniting in the hands of some single body power, formerly exercised independently by many, an amount of power is created infinitely greater than any that existed before, so much more far-reaching as almost to be different in kind. It is entirely fallacious to argue that the great power exercised by a central planning board would be no greater than the power collectively exercised by private boards of directors. There is, in a competitive society, nobody who can exercise even a fraction of the power which a socialist planning board would possess. To decentralize power is to reduce the absolute amount of power, and the competitive system is the only system designed to minimize the power exercised by man over man. Who can seriously doubt that the power which a millionaire, who may be my employer, has over me is very much less than that which the smallest bureaucrat possesses, who wields the coercive power of the state, and on whose discretion it depends how I am allowed to live and work. In every real sense, a badly paid, unskilled workman in this country has more freedom to shape his life than many an employer in Germany or a much better paid engineer or manager in Russia. If he wants to change his job or the place where he lives, if he wants to profess certain views or spend his leisure in a particular way, he faces no absolute impediments. There are no dangers to bodily security and freedom that confine him by brute force to the task and environment to which a superior has assigned him. Our generation has forgotten that the system of private property is the most important guarantee of freedom. It is only because the control of the means of production is divided among many people acting independently that we, as individuals, can decide what to do with ourselves. When all the means of the production are vested in a single hand, whether it be nominally that of society as a whole or that of a dictator, whoever exercises this control has complete power over us. In the hands of private individuals, what is called economic power can be an instrument of coercion, but it is never control over the whole life of a person. But when economic power is centralized as an instrument of political power, it creates a degree of dependence scarcely distinguishable from slavery. It has been well said that in a country where the sole employer is the state, opposition means death by slow starvation. Background to danger. Individualism, in contrast to socialism and all other forms of totalitarianism, is based on the respect of Christianity for the individual man and the belief that it is desirable that men should be free to develop their own individual gifts and bents. This philosophy, first fully developed during the Renaissance, grew and spread into what we know as Western civilization. The general direction of social development was one of freeing the individual from the ties which bound him in feudal society. Perhaps the greatest result of this unchaining of individual energies was the marvelous growth of science. Only since industrial freedom opened the path to the free use of new knowledge, only since everything could be tied, if somebody could be found to back it at his own risk, has science made the great strides which over the last 150 years have changed the face of the world. The result of this growth surpassed all expectations. Wherever the barriers to the free exercise of human ingenuity were removed, man became rapidly able to satisfy ever-widening ranges of desire. By the beginning of the 20th century, the working man in the Western world had reached a degree of material comfort, security, and personal independence which, 100 years before, had hardly seemed possible. The effect of this success was to create among men a new sense of power over their own fate, the belief in the unbounded possibilities of improving their own lot. What had been achieved came to be regarded as a secure and imperishable possession, acquired once and for all, and the rate of progress began to seem too slow. Moreover, the principles which had made this progress possible came to be regarded as obstacles to speedier progress. Impatiently to be brushed away, it might be said that the very success of liberalism became the cause of its decline. No sensible person should have doubted that the economic principles of the 19th century were only a beginning, that there were immense possibilities of advancement on the lines on which we had moved. But according to the views now dominant, the question is no longer how can we make the best use of the spontaneous force found in a free society. We have, in effect, undertaken to dispense with these forces and to replace them by collective and conscious direction. It is significant that this abandonment of liberalism, whether expressed as socialism in its more radical form or merely as organization or planning, was perfected in Germany during the last quarter of the 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th. Germany moved far ahead in both theory and the practice of socialism, so that even today, Russian discussion largely carries on where the Germans left off. The Germans, long before the Nazis, were attacking liberalism and democracy, capitalism and individualism. Long before the Nazis too, the German and Italian socialists were using techniques of which the Nazis and fascists later made effective use. The idea of a political party which embraces all activities of the individual from the cradle to the grave, which claims to guide his views on everything, was first put into practice by the socialists. It was not the fascists, but the socialists who began to collect children at the tenderest age into political organizations to direct their thinking. It was not the fascists, but the socialists who first thought of organizing sports and games, football, hiking, in party clubs where members would not be infected by other views. It was the socialists who first insisted that the party member should distinguish himself from others by the modes of greeting and the forms of address. It was they who, by their organization of cells and devices for the permanent supervision of private life, created the prototype of the totalitarian party. By the time Hitler came to power, liberalism was dead in Germany, and it was socialism that had killed it. To many who have watched the transition from socialism to fascism at close quarters, the connection between the two systems has become increasingly obvious. But in the democracies, the majority of the people still believe that socialism and freedom can be combined. They do not realize that democratic socialism, the great utopia of the last few generations, is not only unachievable, but that to strive for it produces something utterly different, the very destruction of freedom itself. As has been aptly said, what has always made the states a hell on earth has been precisely that man has tried to make it his heaven. It is disquieting to see in England and the United States today the same drawing together of forces and nearly the same contempt of all that is liberal in the old sense. Conservative socialism was the slogan under which a large number of writers prepared the atmosphere in which National Socialism succeeded. It is conservative socialism which is the dominant trend among us now. The liberal way of planning. Planning owes its popularity largely to the fact that everybody desires, of course, that we should handle our common problems with as much foresight as possible. The dispute between the modern planners and the liberals is not on whether we ought to employ systematic thinking in planning our affairs. It is a dispute about what is the best way of doing so. The question is whether we should create conditions under which the knowledge and initiative of individuals are given the best scope so that they can plan most successfully, or whether we should direct and organize all economic activities according to a blueprint that is consciously direct the resources of society to conform to the planners' particular views of who should have what. It is important not to confuse opposition against the latter kind of planning with a dogmatic laissez-faire attitude. The liberal argument does not advocate leaving things just as they are. It favors making the best possible use of the forces of competition as a means of coordinating human effort. It is based on the conviction that where effective competition can be created, it is a better way of guiding individual efforts than any other. It emphasizes that in order to make competition work beneficially, a carefully thought out legal framework is required, and that neither the past nor the existing legal rules are free from grave defects. Liberalism is opposed, however, to supplanting competition by inferior methods of guiding economic activity, and it regards competition as superior, not only because in most circumstances it is the most efficient method known, but because it is the only method which does not require coercive or arbitrary intervention of authority. It dispenses with the need for conscious social control and gives individuals a chance to decide whether the prospects of a particular occupation are sufficient to compensate for the disadvantages connected with it. The successful use of competition does not preclude some types of government interference, for instance, to limit working hours, to require certain sanitary arrangements, to provide an extensive system of social services is fully compatible with the preservation of competition. There are too certain fields where the system of competition is impracticable. For example, the harmful effects of deforestation or of the smoke of factories cannot be confined to the owner of the property in question. But the fact that we have to resort to direct regulation by authority where the conditions for the proper working of competition cannot be created does not prove that we should suppress competition where it can be made to function. To create conditions in which competition will be as effective as possible to prevent fraud and deception, to break up monopolies, these tasks provide a wide and unquestioned field for state activity. This does not mean that it is possible to find some middle way between competition and central direction, though nothing seems at first more plausible or is more likely to appeal to reasonable people. Mere common sense proves a treacherous guide in this field. Although competition can bear some mixture of regulation, it cannot be combined with planning to any extent we like without ceasing to operate as an effective guide to production. Both competition and central direction become poor and inefficient tools if they are incomplete, and a mixture of the two means that neither will work. Planning and competition can be combined only by planning for competition, not by planning against competition. The planning against which all our criticism is directed is solely the planning against competition.